Welcome to this rapid revision video for the Whitechapel unit, looking at the local context and living conditions in Whitechapel. First, let's consider crime in Whitechapel. Victorian Whitechapel is most famous for the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888, but the context is far more complex and fascinating than one horrific series of crimes, which can be seen labelled on the map below. Located in London's East End, it was one of the poorest districts, with about 1,000 homeless people out of a total population of 30,000 people. Poverty contributed to high levels of crime. Overcrowding contributed to theft and domestic violence. Unemployment and underemployment led to stealing and disorder. Prostitution and sex work provided the conditions in which women were exploited by gangs and assaulted. Alcoholism led to violence on the streets, especially around the many public houses. Workhouses were so feared that people turned to crime to survive rather than enter them, for reasons that we'll discover. Orphaned children turned to crime to survive as well. And lastly, perhaps most controversially, immigration. This led to tension and violence between longer established residents and the newly arrived groups of particularly Irish and Jewish people. We're going to consider the issue of living conditions and sanitation first of all, though. London in the 1880s was polluted by fumes and smoke from the industry and coal-fired engines that powered it. In smog conditions, smoke literally choked the streets and anyone in them. Although improvements had ended the scourge of cholera, clean drinking water was still hard to find, and many sewers remained above ground. Housing was overcrowded and unsanitary. Tumble-down rookeries housed multiple poor families with perhaps 30 people crammed into an apartment of a room or two. The 1881 census shows that 30,709 people lived in Whitechapel at this time, and yet there were only 4,069 houses. Others piled into squalid lodging houses, which offered simple beds for a few pennies a night. Filth piled up in the summer, the stench was unbearable. People lived cheek by jowl with rats and other vermin. There was also tremendous inequality. There was poverty and squalor in Whitechapel in the 1880s, but actually that's not the whole story. This is the famous map, or part of it, produced by Charles Booth. It was designed to show the areas of greatest wealth and poverty in London. Not every street was surveyed, as you can see, but the coloured areas were. Here you can see the brighter colours, like the reds, represent middle class and well-to-do families. And the pink represents mixed, some comfortable, others were poor, but most were fairly comfortable. Then we can see the darker colours. The black colours represents the lower class, which Charles Booth classed as vicious and semi-criminal people. Now, he wasn't trying to be particularly uncharitable there. He actually had a lot of sympathy for the poor. But what's interesting about Charles Booth's maps is it showed that the areas could be very mixed. Look along Whitechapel Road. You can see the bright colours of the middle classes being there. And then immediately behind them, just literally yards away, you can see the lower classes with those darker colours. So there is huge inequality, and it's not especially segregated. Yes, there are areas which are mostly poor, there are areas that are mostly middle class, but there are also lots of areas which are truly mixed. Into that complex picture, we can have a look at the 1881 census. This is the one that really fits our studies. This is for the district of St James in Westminster. Here we've got a series of very well-to-do families. Let's take this one for example, a certain Lord Randolph Churchill and Lady Churchill and a certain Master Winston Churchill. He's only a boy then, 6 years old. I wonder what he will go on to do. They live very comfortably in their townhouse, but they're not alone. Look at all the staff and servants they've got working for them. They would be in their own accommodation within the house. That's why they're listed on the census. But in effect, this massive house only really serves 4 people. Let's compare that now to a poorer family from Whitechapel. Here we can see the same census, 1881, although it's not been scanned quite so well. We can see a massive list of people, all of them living at number 41 St Mary's, Whitechapel. But that's not all. You've got to turn over the page to see the rest. That is 19 people all living in a very small house, much smaller than the townhouse that belonged to the Churchills. So you can see that overcrowding was a really massive issue in Whitechapel. So what could be done about it? Well, one example of what was actually done about it was the Peabody estate. Not all housing in Whitechapel was as squalid as the worst examples. In 1875, the government passed a new law, the Artisans' Dwellings Act, which gave councils the power to clear slums and replace them with higher quality housing. The Peabody estate was opened in 1881. It was designed by architect Henry Derbyshire and paid for by American philanthropist George Peabody. He was a wealthy businessman who liked to spend some of his money to help ordinary people. It replaced a rabbit warren of 11 narrow alleyways of cramped and unsanitary housing with something much better. There were 11 modern blocks of flats like the ones in the photograph. Each of these blocks had multiple flats in it for a total of 286 flats. One-room flats had a rent of 1 shilling a week, or for a bit more, a 3-room flat had a local rent of 3 shillings. These were actually really reasonable rents when you compare them to the going rates in often much worse accommodation. Average wages in the areas were only 22 shillings and 6pence a week, and some slum landlords had been charging 8 shillings a week for really substandard housing. So around a third of your income might be going on rent on a really bad slum house. The families who secured flats in the Peabody estate could be considered the lucky few in Whitechapel. But what about the unlucky many? Work versus workhouses. There was very little industry in Whitechapel. The most famous factory was the Bell Foundry. That famously cast Big Ben for the then new Houses of Parliament, but most people worked in uncertain trades. This might include sweated trades like tailoring, shoemaking and matchmaking, working in the home or at a sweatshop and paid a pittance per piece of work. Men were more likely to work as railway construction workers or dock labourers, especially if they were single. Hours were long. 20 hours a day was not unusual for the sweatshops, so think of that, only 4 hours to rest and sleep per day with Sundays off. Wages were also very low and work could be very uncertain. If there was no work, you were unemployed. There was an economic depression in the 1870s which didn't help, and when the railway lines were completed or there were few ships to unload, the work dried up. The truly desperate might resort to living in the workhouse. Workhouses have been set up to provide last resort accommodation for the poor and save money compared to earlier systems of poor relief by the New Poor Law or the Poor Law Amendment Act in 1834. The destitute, elderly, sick, disabled, orphaned or unmarried mothers could get very basic food and lodgings in return for unpleasant and hard work, where they were able to do this. Tramps and vagrants might only stay a day or two, but many families' inmates found themselves trapped in the workhouse, unable to get out. They weren't technically imprisoned, but if they had no job to go to, then they couldn't really leave. Families were split up and could be punished for even talking to each other. The guiding principle was what they called less eligibility. Conditions had to be, by law, worse in the workhouse than those faced by the poorest labourers outside the workhouse. Now just give that some consideration. Think about the conditions that I had just been describing and how terrible they were. So by law, the conditions had to be worse than that in the workhouse. This deterred people from entering them, and of course that kept costs lower. Fear of the workhouse drove some desperate people to crime rather than face the conditions in the workhouse. Whitechapel Workhouse had 405 residents in the 1881 census, and you can see a plan of it from one of the local maps here. You can see how it's arranged in different wings, with a women's wing, a men's wing, and everyone completely separated. And this really is about dreadful conditions. Gruel and bad food were all part of it, as was hard work. So you only went there if you were truly at your wits' end. Many Victorians blamed poverty on laziness and bad life choices, but not all were blind to the suffering in the workhouse. Dr. Thomas Barnardo had trained at the hospital at Whitechapel and decided to try and help children in poverty. An outbreak of disease in Whitechapel had left many children orphaned and desperate. Barnardo opened a school for these children. One of his pupils, Jim Jarvis, wanted to show Dr. Barnardo what conditions were really like for other children. Barnardo was taken to see a secret rooftop space where hundreds of street children gathered every night to avoid ending up in the workhouse. Barnardo was horrified. In 1870 he established an orphanage for boys and later opened up one for girls too. Once the orphanage was full and it turned away an 11-year-old child who was found dead a day or two later. After that point, the motto of Barnardo's homes became "No destitute child ever refused admission," and the homes lived by that motto. By his death in 1905, hundreds of children were given a chance at a better life in almost 100 homes nationally. A modern charity today still carries his name to this day and still does really good work for disadvantaged children. Let's sum up our final points then. Whitechapel is in the East End of London. In the 1880s, it was one of the poorest districts in the whole city. Social problems like unemployment, poor quality housing and alcoholism led in turn to high crime rates and a low quality of life. Bad sanitation and overcrowding made matters worse, even though some families working in sweatshops and unreliable labouring jobs might spend as much as a third of their income on rent. However, there were signs that life could be made better. Peabody Estate was newly built with better quality flats with reasonable rates, but it was an exception. Those left destitute by unemployment, sickness, old age, disability or being orphaned might have to resort to the workhouse. Conditions there were made deliberately awful to deter people from using them and keep costs low. However, from 1870, Dr. Barnardo opened homes to support the orphans and street children of London. That concludes this look at the context of Whitechapel. I hope it's been interesting and useful to you, and if it has, please do drop the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll say goodbye.